The rope swung in lazy circles above the angry crowd, its shadow dancing across the dusty ground like a serpent waiting to strike. And Grace Whitmore knew with absolute certainty that these would be her final moments on Earth, unless a miracle happened in the next 60 seconds. Her hands were bound behind her back, rough hemp cutting into her wrists as two men dragged her toward the makeshift gallows they had constructed outside the Malad City saloon. The Idaho sun beat down mercilessly on this August afternoon in 1878, and sweat trickled down her spine beneath the simple cotton dress that had once been her mother's. She had worn it this morning thinking it would bring her luck at the trial, but there had been no trial. Just accusations, fury, and now this. Murderous! Someone shouted from the crowd, and the word echoed through the assembled townspeople like a curse. She poisoned him in cold blood. That was Martha Henderson, the banker's wife, her face twisted with righteous anger. My cousin was a good man, and she killed him for his money. Grace wanted to scream that it was a lie, that she had loved Thomas Henderson despite his flaws, that she had tried everything to save him when the fever took hold. But her throat was too dry, and her voice had abandoned her hours ago after she had pleaded her innocence, until she was hoarse. No one had listened. No one had cared. Thomas was dead, and someone had to pay, and she was convenient. The sheriff had ridden out 3 days ago to pursue a gang of cattle rustlers and had not yet returned. In his absence, the town had turned into something primitive and terrible, guided by fear and the persuasive tongue of Gerald Henderson, Thomas's brother, who stood at the front of the mob with eyes that burned with hatred and something else. Greed, perhaps. With Thomas dead and Grace hanged as his killer, the small ranch Thomas had built would revert to family, which meant Gerald would finally have the land he had coveted for years. She stumbled as they pushed her forward, her knees buckling. Someone laughed. The rope waited. Then she heard it. The thunder of hoofbeats coming fast, so fast that dust rose in a great cloud at the end of Main Street. The crowd turned, confused, and Grace lifted her head with the last remnants of hope flickering in her chest. The horse was magnificent, a big buckskin gelding that moved like liquid gold in the sunlight, and the man riding him sat tall in the saddle with the easy grace of someone born to it. He wore a dusty brown coat despite the heat, a dark hat pulled low over his eyes, and as he drew closer Grace could see the hard line of his jaw, and the way his hand rested casually near the revolver at his hip. He did not slow down. The crowd scattered like startled chickens as he rode straight through them, the horse's shoulder knocking aside anyone too slow to move. He brought the animal to a sliding stop directly between Grace and the mob, the buckskin's haunches dropping low as it skidded in the dirt. "She leaves with me," the cowboy said, his voice carrying across the sudden silence with absolute authority. Gerald Henderson recovered first, his face purpling with rage. "Who the hell are you? This is none of your business, stranger. This woman is a murderer and she is going to hang." The cowboy shifted in his saddle and Grace saw his eyes for the first time. They were the color of storm clouds, gray and cold and utterly fearless. "Name is Lucas Brennan," he said calmly, "and I am making it my business. You all look like you are about 2 minutes away from a lynching, which is another word for murder, and I have seen enough of that to last a lifetime." "This is justice," Gerald spat. "She poisoned my brother. Did she now?" Lucas swung down from his horse with fluid ease, keeping himself positioned between Grace and the mob. He was tall, she realized, broad-shouldered and lean-hipped, with the weathered face of a man who spent his life outdoors. "And where is your proof?" "Thomas got sick right after she made him dinner. He was dead by morning. If that is not proof, I do not know what is. That is called circumstance, not proof." Lucas hooked his thumbs in his belt, a casual stance that somehow made him look more dangerous rather than less. Could have been 100 things. Bad water, spoiled meat, cholera, the flux. Any of those sound familiar. We know what we know, Martha Henderson shrilled. That woman was after his money from the start. Everyone could see it. Lucas turned his head slightly, and Grace realized he was looking at her for the first time. His gaze swept over her face, her bound hands, the rope marks already forming bruises on her wrists, and something shifted in his expression. It was subtle, just a tightening around his eyes, but it made her breath catch. "She does not look much like a cold-blooded killer to me," he said quietly. "Looks more like a scared woman about to be murdered by a mob too cowardly to wait for the law. How dare you?" Gerald took a step forward and 3 other men moved with him. "The sheriff is gone, and we are not going to wait around for her to run off. Justice needs to be served now." "Justice?" Lucas's voice went hard as iron. "This is not justice. This is vengeance dressed up in righteous clothing, and I will be damned if I stand by and watch it happen." The crowd was growing restless, muttering among themselves. Grace could feel the mood shifting, turning uglier. There were more than 30 people gathered, and Lucas was just one man. No matter how capable he looked, he could not fight them all. "Last chance, stranger," Gerald said, his hand moving toward the pistol at his own hip. "Ride out of here and forget you saw anything, or we will put you in the ground alongside her." Lucas smiled, but it held no warmth whatsoever. "You are welcome to try." The world seemed to hold its breath. Grace could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, could smell the sweat and fear and anger radiating from the crowd. She wanted to tell Lucas to go, to save himself, that she was already dead, and there was no point in him dying too, but her voice still would not come. Then a new voice cut through the tension. "I would not do that if I were you, Gerald." Everyone turned. Old Doc Morrison was pushing through the crowd, his medical bag in one hand and a piece of paper in the other. He was nearly 70, with wispy white hair and a weathered face, but his eyes were sharp and his voice carried authority. "What are you doing here, Doc?" Gerald demanded. "This does not concern you. I beg to differ." Doc Morrison walked right up to Lucas and nodded a greeting before turning to face the mob. "I have been examining Thomas's body at the undertaker's, took some samples, did some tests, and I found something interesting." Grace felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. Doc Morrison had been kind to her, one of the few people in town who had not immediately assumed her guilt, but she had not dared to hope he would find anything. "Thomas Henderson did not die of poisoning," Doc Morrison announced, holding up the paper. "He died of appendicitis. His appendix ruptured, probably around midnight based on the condition of the body. That caused infection to spread through his abdomen. There was nothing anyone could have done to save him, even if we had known what was happening. It is a quick death and a painful one, but it is not murder." The silence that followed was deafening. "You are lying," Gerald said flatly. "You are protecting her." "I am a doctor," Morrison replied with steel in his voice. "I do not lie about causes of death. I have written up my findings here, and any other doctor can examine the body and confirm it. Your brother died of natural causes, Gerald. Tragic, yes. Unexpected, certainly. But not murder." Grace's knees gave out entirely, and she would have fallen if Lucas had not moved with startling speed, catching her with one arm around her waist. He held her upright easily, his strength evident, and she leaned against him because she had no choice. "Cut her loose," Lucas ordered, and his free hand moved to the knife at his belt. Gerald looked like he wanted to argue, but the crowd was already dispersing, people muttering and shaking their heads as they drifted away. The bloodlust was fading, replaced by shame and confusion. Martha Henderson was crying. Whether from relief or disappointment, Grace could not tell. Lucas cut the ropes binding her wrists with one quick slice, and Grace gasped as blood rushed back into her hands. The pain was incredible, pins and needles shooting up her arms, and she swayed against Lucas's solid warmth. "Easy," he murmured, his voice softer now, meant only for her. "I have got you. You are safe." "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Thank you. I thought I was going to die. I thought, do not think about it." His arm was still around her waist, steadying her, and she could feel the lean strength of him, the way he held her like she weighed nothing. "Can you stand?" she nodded, though she was not entirely sure it was true. Her legs felt like water, but she forced herself to straighten, to step away from his support, even though every instinct screamed to stay close to this man who had saved her life. Doc Morrison was beside them now, his gnarled hands gentle as he examined her wrists. "You will have bruises, but nothing is broken. Go home, Grace. Rest, and stay away from the Henderson family for a while." Gerald was still standing there, his face a mask of rage and frustration. "This is not over," he said, but the threat sounded hollow now. "That land should be mine." "The land belongs to Grace now," Doc Morrison said firmly. "Thomas married her legal and proper, and that makes her his widow. You have no claim on it, Gerald, and you never did." That was what this had really been about, Grace realized with dawning horror. Not justice, not even vengeance. Just greed. Gerald had been willing to murder her to get his hands on 160 acres of decent grazing land and a small house. Lucas stepped forward, and though he did not touch Gerald, the threat was implicit. "If anything happens to her," he said softly, "anything at all, I will know where to look. Do we understand each other?" Gerald's jaw worked, but he nodded once sharply before turning and stalking away. The few remaining townspeople scattered, leaving Grace alone in the street with Lucas and Doc Morrison. "Thank you," she said again, looking at both of them. "I do not know how to repay you for what you have done." "No repayment necessary," Doc Morrison said kindly. "I just told the truth." "But Lucas here saved your life, and that is not something easily forgotten." Lucas was already moving toward his horse, checking the saddle and adjusting the reins with practiced efficiency. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Grace said firmly, finding her voice at last. "They would not have. Everyone in this town watched them drag me to that rope, and not one person tried to stop them. Not one. Until you." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Grace felt her breath catch for the second time. His eyes were not cold now. They were warm and troubled in something else she could not quite name. "Where are you staying?" he asked. "I have a house. The ranch Thomas and I." She swallowed hard. "The ranch is about 3 miles west of town. Small place, just a house and a barn and some grazing land." "I will ride out with you," Lucas said. "Make sure you get there safely." "Oh, you do not have to do that. I have already imposed on you enough. It was not a request." He swung up into the saddle and then held out his hand to her. "You just escaped a lynching by about 2 minutes. And there are a lot of people in this town who are not going to be happy about that once they have time to think about it. You should not be alone right now." He was right, though she hated to admit it. Grace took his hand, marveling at the callous strength of his palm, and let him pull her up behind him on the horse. She had to put her arms around his waist to keep from falling, and even through the layers of clothing, she could feel the solid warmth of him. "Hold on tight," he said, and urged the buckskin into an easy walk. They rode through Malad City in silence, Grace acutely aware of the faces watching from windows, the whispers that would already be starting. By tomorrow, everyone would know what had happened, would know that a stranger had ridden in and stopped the hanging, would know that Grace Whitmore was somehow still alive. The afternoon sun was starting its descent toward the western mountains as they left town behind, following the rutted wagon road that led to her property. Grace rested her cheek against Lucas's back, suddenly exhausted down to her bones. The fear and terror of the past hours were catching up with her, making her shake. "You are trembling," Lucas said quietly. "We are almost there. Just hold on a little longer." "I am fine," she lied. "I just need to get home. I need to feed the chickens and milk the cow and check the water barrels, and all of that can wait." His voice was firm but not unkind. "Right now you need to rest." Her house came into view as they crested a small rise, and Grace felt tears prick her eyes at the sight of it. It was nothing special, just a small wooden structure with a covered porch and a chimney, but it was hers. Thomas had built it with his own hands before he had brought her here as his bride 6 months ago. 6 months. Such a short time to go from hopeful newlywed to accused murderer to widow. Lucas rode right up to the porch and dismounted before helping her down. Her legs nearly buckled again, and he steadied her with both hands on her waist. "Easy," he said again. "When did you last eat?" "Yesterday morning." She had been too terrified to eat since then. He nodded as if he had expected that answer. "Sit down on the porch. I am going to see to my horse, and then I am going to make you something to eat. You do not have to, Grace." He said her name for the first time, and it sounded different in his voice, softer somehow. "Let someone help you. You have been through hell today. It is all right to accept a little kindness." She wanted to argue, wanted to maintain her independence and her pride, but the truth was she was not sure she could stand much longer. So she nodded and sank down onto the porch steps, watching as Lucas led his horse to the small barn. He moved with such easy confidence, she thought, like a man completely comfortable in his own skin, sure of his place in the world. She envied that. She had never felt sure of anything, had always been scrambling to survive, to make a place for herself in a world that seemed determined to grind her down. Her parents had died when she was 16, leaving her with nothing but debts and a trunk of clothes. She had worked as a seamstress for 2 years, barely scraping by, before Thomas Henderson had offered her marriage. He had been 20 years older than her and not particularly handsome, but he had been kind in his way, and she had been desperate for security. It had not been a love match, but she had been a good wife to him, had cooked and cleaned and tried to make him happy. And when he had gotten sick that terrible night, she had done everything she could. She had cooled his fever, given him water, held his hand as he thrashed in pain. She had not known what was wrong, had not understood why he was dying, but she had stayed with him until the end. Then his brother had shown up in the morning, had taken one look at the situation, and started making accusations. Within hours, the whole town had been convinced of her guilt, and by afternoon they had been building a gallows. If Lucas Brennan had not ridden into town at that exact moment, she would be dead now. Her body would be hanging from a rope in the middle of Main Street, a warning to other women who might dare to marry above their station. She shuddered and wrapped her arms around herself. Lucas emerged from the barn and climbed the porch steps, his boots thudding on the worn wood. "Your cow needs milking," he said. "I will take care of that in a bit. Right now, let us get some food in you." He opened the door to her house without waiting for permission, and Grace followed him inside. It felt strange to have a man here, someone who was not Thomas, but it also felt right somehow. Safe. The house was simple inside, just 2 rooms. The main room held a stove, a table with 2 chairs, a few shelves for dishes and supplies, and a rocking chair by the fireplace. The bedroom was through a door to the left, containing only a bed and a dresser and little else. Lucas moved to the stove and began building up the fire with practiced efficiency. Grace sank into one of the chairs and watched him, too tired to do anything else. "There is bread in the box on the shelf," she said, "and some ham in the cold cellar out back. Eggs in the basket by the door. I will find it." He had the fire going in moments and was already assembling ingredients. How about some eggs and ham and bread? Simple but filling. "That sounds wonderful." They fell into silence as he cooked, and Grace studied him covertly. He had taken off his hat, revealing thick, dark hair that needed a trim. His face was all hard planes and angles, the face of a man who had seen hard times and survived them. There was a scar on his jaw, a thin white line that might have been a knife wound, and his hands moved with the easy competence of someone who had cooked for himself many times before. "How old are you?" she asked suddenly, then flushed. "I am sorry, that was rude." "I just 27, he said without looking up from the pan. "You, 20, almost 21, he nodded as if that confirmed something in his mind. "You are young to be a widow." "I am young to have almost been hanged," she replied, and was surprised when he laughed. "Fair point." He divided the eggs and ham onto 2 plates and brought them to the table, along with thick slices of bread and a jar of butter. "Eat, all of it." She picked up her fork and realized her hands were still shaking. Lucas noticed too, and his expression softened. "It will pass," he said quietly. "The fear, it will take time, but it will pass. You sound like you know from experience." "I do." He did not elaborate, and she did not push. The food was simple but delicious, and Grace ate ravenously once she started. She had not realized how hungry she was until the first bite hit her stomach. Lucas ate steadily, watching her with those storm-gray eyes. "Where are you from?" she asked between bites. "You are not from around here." "Texas originally, but I have been moving around for a few years now. Working cattle drives, ranch work, whatever I can find." "What brings you to Idaho?" he shrugged. "Heard there was work up this way, thought I would see what I could find. I was just passing through Malad City when I saw the crowd gathering, knew immediately something was wrong." "Thank God you did." Grace set down her fork, her appetite suddenly gone despite the half-empty plate. "They would have killed me, Lucas. They were so angry, so certain I was guilty. No one cared about the truth. People get scared and they do stupid things." He pushed her plate back toward her. "Finish eating. You need your strength." She forced down a few more bites, then pushed the plate away. "I cannot eat anymore. My stomach is tied in knots." He nodded and started cleaning up, moving around her kitchen like he belonged there. Grace watched him, a strange feeling unfolding in her chest. Gratitude, yes, but something else too. Something warm and unsettling. "You should rest," Lucas said when the dishes were washed and put away. "Go lie down for a while. I will take care of the animals and make sure everything is secure." "You are doing too much," she protested. "You saved my life. You do not owe me anything else." "Maybe I want to help." He looked at her directly, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "You have been through something terrible today, Grace. Let someone take care of you for a few hours. Tomorrow you can go back to being independent and capable. Tonight just rest." She wanted to argue, but the exhaustion was pulling at her like a physical weight. "All right," she whispered. "Thank you." She went into the bedroom and lay down on the bed fully clothed, too tired to even remove her shoes. Through the open door she could hear Lucas moving around, the sound of the door closing as he went out to tend the animals. The sounds were comforting somehow, the knowledge that someone was watching over her. Grace closed her eyes and was asleep in seconds. She woke to darkness and the smell of coffee brewing. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure where she was or what had happened, and then it all came rushing back. The mob, the rope, Lucas riding in like an avenging angel. She sat up slowly, her body aching. Her wrists throbbed where the rope had cut into them, and her shoulders were stiff from the way her arms had been bound. But she was alive. Against all odds, she was alive. Grace stood and walked into the main room. Lucas was sitting at the table, a cup of coffee in front of him, staring into the fire. He looked up when she entered. "How long did I sleep?" she asked. "Few hours. It is about 8 o'clock now." He gestured to the coffee pot on the stove. "There is coffee if you want it. And I brought in some milk and eggs. Fed the chickens and the cow and your horse. Everything is taken care of for the night." She poured herself a cup of coffee and joined him at the table, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "You did not have to do all that. I know." He smiled slightly. "I wanted to." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and Grace realized this was the first time since Thomas died that she had felt even remotely safe. Not just physically safe, but emotionally. Like maybe everything was going to be all right after all. "What will you do now?" Lucas asked. "Stay here. I do not know." She had not had time to think about the future. "This is my home now, I suppose. Thomas left it to me in his will, but I do not know if I can stay in Malad City after what happened. Everyone thought I was a murderer. How do I live with that?" "People will forget eventually, or at least move on to the next scandal." Lucas sipped his coffee. "But if you want to leave, I would not blame you." "Where would I go? I have no family, no money except what little Thomas left. This ranch is all I have." "You could sell it. Start over somewhere else." The thought was tempting, but also terrifying. "I do not know if I have the courage for that." Lucas looked at her with those intense gray eyes. "You faced down a mob today. I think you have more courage than you realize." She felt herself flush and looked down at her coffee cup. That was not courage, that was just blind terror. Sometimes they are the same thing. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark night. "I should go. There is a boarding house in town. I can get a room there and stay." The word was out before she could stop it. Grace felt her face heat even more. "I mean, it is late, and it is a long ride back to town in the dark. You could sleep in the barn. Or there is a bedroll in the chest there. You could sleep by the fire. I do not want you to leave on my account." Lucas turned to look at her, something unreadable in his expression. "Are you sure? People already saw us leave town together. If I am here all night, there will be talk." "Let them talk," Grace said with more confidence than she felt. "They already think the worst of me. What is one more scandal?" He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, I will stay, but I am sleeping by the fire, not in your bedroom. Let us at least give the gossip some limits." She laughed, surprising herself. It felt good to laugh after the horror of the day. "Agreed." They talked for another hour, safe, casual conversation about nothing in particular. Lucas told her about Texas, about the ranch where he had grown up, about the cattle drives he had worked. She told him about her childhood, about her parents and their small farm, about the years after they died. It was easier to talk to him than she had expected. He listened without judgment, without interruption, and when he spoke, his words were thoughtful and genuine. She found herself relaxing in his presence, the fear and tension of the day slowly draining away. Finally, Grace stood and stretched. "I should try to sleep. Tomorrow I need to figure out what to do about the ranch and the town and everything." "One day at a time," Lucas advised. "Do not try to solve everything at once." She nodded and started toward the bedroom, then paused. "Lucas, thank you for everything. I know I keep saying it, but I mean it. You saved my life today." "I am glad I was there," he said simply. "Sleep well, Grace." She closed the bedroom door and changed into her nightgown, then slipped under the covers. Through the door she could hear Lucas moving around, settling down with the bedroll by the fire. The sounds were comforting, and for the first time in days Grace felt safe enough to truly relax. She fell asleep quickly and dreamed of gray eyes and strong hands and a voice that promised safety. Morning came bright and clear, sunlight streaming through the small bedroom window. Grace woke slowly, stretching and wincing at the soreness in her body. Her wrists were badly bruised, purple and black marks circling them like bracelets of pain. They would heal, she told herself. Everything would heal given time. She dressed carefully and emerged from the bedroom to find Lucas already up, the smell of bacon filling the small house. He looked up and smiled when he saw her. "Morning. Hope you do not mind, I raided your supplies again." "Of course not." She moved to help him, and they worked together in easy silence, preparing breakfast. It felt domestic and natural, like they had done this 100 times before instead of just once. They had just sat down to eat when there was a knock at the door. Grace tensed, her heart jumping into her throat, but Lucas laid a gentle hand on her arm. "I will get it," he said calmly. He opened the door to reveal Doc Morrison standing on the porch, his medical bag in hand and a serious expression on his weathered face. "Morning, Lucas." "Grace." The doctor nodded to them both. "Mind if I come in?" "Of course." Grace stood quickly. "Is something wrong?" "Not wrong exactly, but I thought you should know what is happening in town." Doc Morrison came inside and accepted the cup of coffee Lucas offered him. "There has been quite a bit of talk since yesterday." "I can imagine," Grace said quietly. "Most folks are ashamed of themselves, truth be told." Once they had time to cool down and think about what almost happened, a lot of people realized they were about to murder an innocent woman. That sits heavy on the conscience. "And the ones who are not ashamed?" Lucas asked, his voice hard. "There are a few. Gerald Henderson mostly and a couple of his friends. They are angry that you interfered, Lucas, saying you had no right, that you should have stayed out of it." Doc Morrison looked at Grace. "I am worried they might try something. Gerald is not a good man and he has been drinking since yesterday afternoon. Drunk men do stupid things." Grace felt cold fear creep up her spine. "What should I do?" "That is why I am here." The doctor pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. "This is a letter I wrote to the territorial marshal in Boise City, explaining what happened, what I found when I examined Thomas's body, and my concerns about Gerald's behavior. I sent it this morning with the stagecoach. The marshal should receive it in a few days, and I expect he will send someone to investigate." "Thank you," Grace said gratefully. "But what do I do until then?" Doc Morrison looked at Lucas. "That is where you come in, son. I know you are a drifter, that you were probably planning to move on, but I am asking you to stay for a few days, just until we know Grace is safe." Lucas did not hesitate. "I was planning to stay anyway." "Good man." The doctor stood and put on his hat. "Grace, I would also suggest you do not go into town alone for a while. Give people time to settle down. And if Gerald or any of his friends show up here, you do not talk to them. You do not let them in. You send for me or the deputy or someone right away." "I understand." After Doc Morrison left, Grace and Lucas finished their breakfast in silence. Grace could feel the weight of everything pressing down on her, the fear and uncertainty of what came next. "What about your plans?" she asked finally. "You said you were looking for work." "You should not have to stay here and play nursemaid to me." Lucas looked at her steadily. "This is where I want to be. But you do not even know me. We just met yesterday. You do not owe me anything." "Maybe not." He stood and began clearing the dishes. "But the way I see it, I have two choices. I can ride out of here and spend the rest of my life wondering if you were all right, wondering if something happened to you that I could have prevented. Or I can stay for a few days, make sure you are safe, and then move on with a clear conscience." "And what do I do?" Grace asked, hating how small her voice sounded. "Sit here like a damsel in distress waiting to be rescued?" "No." Lucas smiled slightly. "You do what you need to do to keep this ranch running. Take care of your animals, work your land, live your life. I am just going to be here, that is all. Think of me as hired help. I cannot pay you. I am not asking to be paid. They stared at each other across the small kitchen, and Grace felt something shift between them, something warm and dangerous and entirely too appealing. "All right," she said softly. "Stay for a few days. Until we know it is safe." "It is settled then." The next few days fell into an easy rhythm. Lucas slept by the fire each night and woke early each morning to help with the chores. He was surprisingly good at ranch work, handling everything from milking the cow to repairing a broken section of fence with casual competence. Grace found herself looking forward to seeing him each morning, found herself disappointed each evening when he settled down by the fire instead of staying up to talk longer. She told herself it was just gratitude, that she was only drawn to him because he had saved her life. But deep down she knew it was more than that. Lucas Brennan was unlike any man she had ever met. He was strong but gentle, confident but not arrogant, and when he looked at her, she felt seen in a way she never had before. On the third day after the hanging, Grace was working in the small vegetable garden behind the house when she heard horses approaching. She straightened quickly, her heart pounding, and was relieved when Lucas appeared around the corner of the house. "3 riders coming," he said quietly. "Stay here." "Who are they?" "I do not know yet, but I am going to find out." He walked around to the front of the house, and Grace followed despite his instruction to stay put. She was not going to hide while trouble came to her door. The riders were indeed approaching, 3 men on horseback moving at a leisurely pace. As they drew closer, Grace felt her stomach drop. Gerald Henderson was in the lead, flanked by 2 of his friends, both rough-looking men who worked at the lumber mill. Lucas stood on the porch, his hand resting casually near his revolver. "That is close enough," he called out when they were still 20 yards away. Gerald reined in his horse, his face twisted with anger. "This is not your property, Brennan. You have no right to tell us where we can go." "Grace owns this property," Lucas replied calmly, "and she does not want you here, so turn around and ride out." "I came to talk to my brother's widow," Gerald said, his eyes sliding to Grace. "About business matters, that is all." "Then you can talk through me," Lucas said. "What business matters?" Gerald's jaw clenched. "Thomas owed me money, $500. I have come to collect," Grace gasped. "That is a lie. Thomas never mentioned any debt to you." "He borrowed it 6 months ago to help pay for this place," Gerald insisted. "I have a promissory note." "Then show it to a lawyer," Lucas said flatly. "If you have a legitimate claim, go through the proper channels. But you are not going to come here and intimidate Grace into paying you money she may not owe." "This is none of your business, Drifter," one of Gerald's companions spoke up. "You should ride on before you get hurt." Lucas smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Is that a threat?" "It is a promise," the man replied, his hand moving toward his gun. Everything happened very fast. Lucas drew his revolver in one smooth motion, so quick Grace barely saw it, and suddenly he was holding the gun steady and level, pointed directly at the man who had threatened him. "I would not," Lucas said softly. "I am very good with this, and I do not miss." The man froze, his hand still inches from his weapon. The other 2 riders had also tensed, and the air was thick with potential violence. "You 3 need to leave," Lucas said, his voice still calm but carrying an edge of steel. "Right now. And if you come back here, if you bother Grace again, I will not be so polite next time." "You cannot protect her forever," Gerald spat. "Eventually you will leave, and when I do, the territorial marshal will have already been here to investigate your brother's death," Lucas interrupted. "Doc Morrison wrote to him days ago, so if anything happens to Grace, anything at all, you will be the first person they look at." "Do you really want to take that risk?" Gerald's face went pale, then red with fury. But he jerked his horse's head around and kicked it into a gallop, racing away from the house. His two companions followed, casting dark looks over their shoulders as they rode. Lucas holstered his gun and turned to Grace. "Are you all right?" She realized she was shaking. "That was terrifying. I know, but they are gone now." He came down off the porch and put his hands on her shoulders, steadying her. "Listen to me, Grace. Gerald is a bully and a coward. He will not come back, not after today. He knows he is being watched. But what if you had not been here? What if I had been alone? You were not alone, and you will not be." His hands were warm on her shoulders, and she could see the concern in his gray eyes. "I am not leaving until I know you are safe. I promise." Grace looked up at him, at this man who had crashed into her life like a thunderstorm and changed everything, and felt her heart do something complicated in her chest. This was dangerous, she knew. She was falling for him, falling hard, and he was going to leave eventually. Drifters always left. That was what they did. But in that moment, with his hands on her shoulders and his eyes searching her face, she did not care about eventually. She only cared about now. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything." Lucas started to reply, then seemed to think better of it. He dropped his hands and stepped back, putting space between them. "Let us get back to work. That fence in the east pasture still needs fixing." They spent the rest of the day working together, but something had shifted. Grace was acutely aware of Lucas now, of the way he moved, the sound of his voice, the rare smiles he offered. She caught him watching her sometimes, his expression thoughtful, and she wondered what he was thinking. That evening they sat on the porch together, watching the sun set over the mountains. The air was cooling rapidly, as it always did in Idaho once the sun went down, and Grace wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. "It is beautiful here," Lucas said quietly. "Different from Texas. Greener." "Do you miss it?" "Texas," he was quiet for a long moment. "Sometimes, but there is nothing for me to go back to. My parents are dead. The ranch was sold years ago. I have been moving around ever since." "That sounds lonely." "It can be." He looked at her. "But it has its advantages too. No ties. No responsibilities. Freedom to go where I want when I want." Grace heard what he was not saying. He was reminding her, and maybe himself, that he was not going to stay, that this was temporary. "That does sound nice," she said, keeping her voice light. "I have never been anywhere but here." "Well, here and the small town where I grew up, but that is only about 50 miles away. I have never seen an ocean or a big city or any of the things people write about in books." "Maybe someday you will. Maybe." But she doubted it. She was tied to this land now, for better or worse. This ranch was her future, her security, her whole world. The silence stretched between them, comfortable but charged with things unsaid. Finally, Lucas stood and stretched. "I should check the barn before it gets full dark. Make sure everything is locked up tight. I will come with you." They walked together through the gathering twilight, their shoulders almost touching but not quite. The barn was warm and smelled of hay and animals, and Grace moved to check on the cow while Lucas examined the doors and windows. "Everything looks secure," he said. "No one is getting in here without us knowing." Grace nodded, stroking the cow's soft nose. "Lucas, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you really stop that day? In town, I mean. Why did you risk your life for a stranger?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then he sighed and leaned against the stall door. "Because I have seen too much senseless violence in my life," he said finally. "I have seen good people hurt for no reason. I have stood by and done nothing when I should have acted, and I promised myself I would not do that anymore. If I saw something wrong, something I could stop, I would not turn away." He looked at her. "When I saw that mob, saw you standing there terrified and helpless, I knew I could not ride past. I would have hated myself forever if I had. You are a good man, Lucas Brennan." "I am just a man," he replied. "Nothing special. You are special to me." The words were out before she could stop them, and Grace felt her face flame with embarrassment. "I mean, because you saved my life, I know what you mean." He was smiling now, a real smile that reached his eyes. "And you are special to me too, Grace Whitmore." They stared at each other across the dim barn, and the air between them seemed to crackle with electricity. Grace felt her heart pounding, felt the pull toward him like gravity, and she knew she was in trouble. Big trouble. "We should go back to the house," Lucas said, his voice rough. "It is getting cold." They walked back in silence, but now it was not comfortable at all. It was tense and uncertain and full of awareness. Grace could feel the heat of him beside her, could hear his breathing, and it made her dizzy. That night she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, knowing Lucas was just on the other side of the door, knowing he was probably thinking about her the way she was thinking about him, knowing this could not end well, but unable to stop herself from wanting it anyway. She finally fell asleep near dawn and woke to sunlight and the smell of coffee and the sound of horses approaching again. Grace bolted out of bed, her heart in her throat, and rushed into the main room. Lucas was already at the window, looking out. "Who is it?" she asked fearfully. "Riders." "4 of them this time," he frowned. "Wait, that is a badge. It is the marshal." Relief flooded through her so intensely she felt dizzy. The territorial marshal was here. Finally, someone official, someone with authority. They went out onto the porch together as the 4 riders approached. The lead man was in his 50s with a gray mustache and hard eyes. He wore a badge on his vest and carried himself with the authority of long experience. "Grace Whitmore," he called out as he reined in his horse. "Yes, sir." "I am Marshal Calhoun. Doc Morrison wrote to me about the situation here." "Mind if we talk?" "Of course." "Please come in." The marshal and one of his deputies came inside while the other 2 remained outside keeping watch. Marshal Calhoun accepted coffee and settled into a chair at the table, his keen eyes taking in everything. "Doc Morrison told me what happened," he said without preamble. "Told me about your husband's death, about the mob, about Gerald Henderson's accusations. I have reviewed the doctor's findings regarding cause of death, and I agree with his assessment. Thomas Henderson died of natural causes, not poison." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you. I tried to tell them, but no one would listen. Mobs rarely do." The marshal's voice was grim. "Which is why we have laws and courts instead of letting people take justice into their own hands. You are very lucky this young man was passing through when he was." He nodded at Lucas. "You showed considerable courage, son." "I did what anyone should have done," Lucas replied, "but most would not have." The marshal turned back to Grace. "I have spoken with several people in town, and it is clear to me that Gerald Henderson manufactured this entire situation because he wanted your land. He has been making threats and spreading lies about you. I am placing him under arrest for attempted lynching and incitement to riot." "You are arresting him?" Grace could hardly believe it. "Yes, madam. And I am charging several others who were part of that mob as well. What happened to you was criminal, and I intend to make sure everyone knows that mob justice will not be tolerated in this territory." Grace started crying then, unable to hold back the tears. All the fear and stress of the past week came pouring out, and she buried her face in her hands. She felt Lucas's hand on her back, warm and comforting, and leaned into his touch. "You are safe now," Marshal Calhoun said kindly. "Gerald Henderson is not going to bother you again. I give you my word on that." They talked for another hour, the marshal asking questions and taking notes. He wanted a full statement from Grace about everything that had happened, and she gave it, reliving the horror of that day. Lucas also gave his account, and the marshal listened carefully to both. Finally, the lawman stood and put on his hat. "We will be staying in town for a few days while I finish my investigation. If you think of anything else, anything at all, you come find me. Understand?" "Yes, sir. Thank you." After the marshal left, Grace and Lucas stood on the porch watching the riders disappear down the road. Grace felt lighter than she had in weeks, like a massive weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "It is really over," she said wonderingly. "Gerald is going to jail. I am safe." "You are safe," Lucas agreed, but his voice was strange. Grace turned to look at him and felt her heart sink. He was already pulling away, she could see it in his eyes. He had stayed to make sure she was protected, and now that threat was gone, which meant he would be leaving. "When will you go?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Tomorrow morning, I think. Give the marshal one more day to make sure everything is settled, and then I will move on." "Where will you go?" he shrugged. "North, maybe. I heard there is work in Montana. Lots of ranches hiring for the fall roundup." Grace nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She had known this was coming, had known from the beginning that Lucas was a drifter who would not stay. But knowing it and feeling it were two different things entirely. "I will write you," Lucas said suddenly, "if you want. Let you know where I am, what I am doing." "I would like that." She forced herself to smile. "And you are welcome to come back any time. If you are ever in the area, you will always have a place to stay here." "Thank you." He looked like he wanted to say something else, but he just nodded and turned away. "I am going to check on the horses." Grace went back inside and sank into a chair, feeling like her heart was breaking. It was ridiculous, she told herself. She had known him less than a week. You could not fall in love with someone in less than a week. Except she had. Somehow, impossibly, she had fallen completely and hopelessly in love with Lucas Brennan. She spent the rest of the day in a fog, going through the motions of her chores but barely present. Lucas was quiet too, and they moved around each other carefully, like two people afraid of breaking something fragile. That evening they made dinner together one last time, and the silence was painful. Grace kept stealing glances at him, memorizing his face, the way his hair fell across his forehead, the strong line of his jaw, the way his hands moved with such sure competence. After dinner, Lucas went outside and Grace heard the sound of the barn door opening and closing. He was probably checking on his horse, making sure it was ready for travel in the morning. She should let him go, she told herself. He had made it clear he was not staying. She should thank him one more time, wish him well, and move on with her life. She should not make this harder than it already was, but her heart had other ideas. Grace found herself standing and walking to the door, then outside into the cool evening air. She crossed the yard to the barn and pushed open the door. Lucas was standing by his horse checking the saddle, and he looked up when she entered. "Grace, is something wrong?" "No. Yes, I do not know." She moved closer, her heart pounding so hard she thought he must be able to hear it. "Lucas, I need to say something before you leave tomorrow." He straightened, watching her warily. "All right. I know you are a drifter. I know you do not stay in one place, and I know we have only known each other a few days. But I need you to know that you mean something to me, more than just someone who saved my life. You mean something." Lucas was very still. "Grace, I am not asking you to stay," she interrupted quickly. "I know you have your own life, your own plans. I just needed you to know that you will not be forgotten, that if you ever want to come back, there will be someone here who cares about you, who will be thinking about you." She was crying now, tears streaming down her face, but she did not care. She had to say this, had to let him know before he left, and she never saw him again. Lucas crossed the space between them in 2 long strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. Grace wrapped her arms around him and held on, breathing in the scent of him, feeling the solid strength of him. "I do not want to leave you," he said roughly, his lips against her hair. I've been trying to convince myself that I should, that staying is a bad idea, but God help me, Grace, I do not want to go." She pulled back to look up at him, hope blooming in her chest. "Then do not. Stay. I have nothing to offer you, no money, no prospects. I am just a cowboy with a horse and a saddle and not much else. I do not care about that. I have this ranch. We can work it together. We can build something here. People will talk. We are not married. We barely know each other. Then marry me." The words were out before she could think about them, bold and reckless and absolutely right. "I know it is fast. I know it is crazy. But I also know that what I feel for you is real, Lucas. I love you. I think I started falling in love with you the moment you rode between me and that mob. So marry me. Stay with me. Build a life with me." Lucas stared at her for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face. Then he cupped her cheek with one calloused hand and leaned down to kiss her. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, like he was asking permission. Grace rose up on her toes and kissed him back with all the emotion churning inside her, and the kiss deepened, became something hungry and desperate and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Lucas rested his forehead against hers. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Really sure, because if we do this, I am not leaving, ever. You will be stuck with me for the rest of your life." "I am sure." Grace smiled through her tears. "I have never been more sure of anything." "Then yes. Yes, I will marry you, Grace Whitmore, and I will love you and protect you and stand by you for as long as I live." They kissed again, and this time it was a promise, a commitment, a beginning. Marshal Calhoun agreed to perform the ceremony the next day, standing in Grace's small front room with Doc Morrison as witness. It was simple and quick, just a few words and the exchange of promises, but it was also perfect. Grace wore her mother's dress again, the same one she had worn to the almost hanging, but this time it brought her joy instead of sorrow. Lucas wore his cleanest shirt and looked nervous and handsome and so dear she could hardly stand it. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Marshal Calhoun intoned. "You may kiss your bride." Lucas did thoroughly, and Doc Morrison laughed and clapped them both on the back. "Congratulations," the doctor said warmly. "I had a feeling you two would figure it out. Saw the way you looked at each other from the start." They celebrated with a simple meal, and then the marshal and doctor left, heading back to town to finish dealing with Gerald Henderson and the others involved in the mob. Grace and Lucas were left alone in the house, and suddenly the air between them was charged with awareness. "We are married," Grace said wonderingly. "We are." Lucas pulled her into his arms. "Are you having second thoughts? Not even a little." She kissed him again, loving the way he responded, the way his arms tightened around her. "Are you?" "Never." That night they consummated their marriage in the small bedroom, and it was awkward and sweet and absolutely right. Lucas was gentle with her, patient, and Grace felt her love for him deepen even further as he held her close afterward. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "I cannot believe I almost rode away from you, but you did not. You stayed, and now you are stuck with me. Best thing that ever happened to me." The next morning they woke early and began making plans. Lucas knew ranching and Grace was a quick learner. Together they started improving the property, fixing things that had fallen into disrepair, building up the small herd of cattle. It was hard work, but satisfying, and they fell into bed each night exhausted and happy. Word spread through Malad City about the marriage, and reactions were mixed. Some people were scandalized that Grace had remarried so quickly after Thomas's death. Others were happy for her, glad she had found someone. A few even apologized for their part in the mob, shamefaced and sincere. Grace accepted the apologies but kept her distance from town as much as possible. She did not need the approval of people who had been willing to hang her. She had Lucas, and that was enough. Gerald Henderson was convicted of incitement to riot and several other charges. He was sentenced to 3 years in the territorial prison, and his property was sold to pay fines and restitution. Grace heard the news with grim satisfaction. Justice had been served, finally. As summer turned to fall, Grace realized her monthly courses had not come. She waited another few weeks to be sure, then told Lucas one evening over dinner, "I think I am with child." He dropped his fork, eyes wide. "Really? You are sure? Pretty sure. I will go see Doc Morrison tomorrow to confirm, but I know how my body feels." She smiled at him. "We are going to have a baby, Lucas." He was out of his chair in an instant, pulling her up and spinning her around, laughing with pure joy. "A baby. We are having a baby." Doc Morrison confirmed it the next day, and suddenly their future felt even more real. They would be parents. They would raise a child together on this ranch, build a family, create something lasting. The pregnancy was relatively easy, and Grace continued working alongside Lucas as long as she could. He was protective almost to the point of being ridiculous, constantly worrying about her overexerting herself, but she loved him for it. Winter came early that year, snow blanketing the ranch in November and not letting up until March. It was hard work keeping the animals fed and safe, but they managed. Lucas proved himself over and over, working from dawn to dark without complaint. Grace gave birth in April of 1879, laboring through a long night with Doc Morrison and Lucas both at her side. When the baby finally arrived, squalling and red-faced and absolutely perfect, Lucas held him with tears streaming down his face. "A son," he said wonderingly. "We have a son." They named him Daniel Thomas Brennan, honoring Grace's father and Thomas Henderson both. Lucas said it was important to remember the man who had given Grace a home when she needed one, even if their marriage had not been a love match. Daniel was a good baby, healthy and strong, with his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair. Grace had never known she could love someone so much, that her heart could expand to hold this much joy. As Daniel grew, the ranch prospered. Lucas added more cattle, improved the grazing land, and built an addition onto the house so they would have more room. Grace kept chickens and a large garden, and they became largely self-sufficient. Other children followed. When Daniel was 2, Grace gave birth to twin daughters, Emily and Sarah, who were beautiful and mischievous and kept them all running. 3 years after that came another son, Robert, and then finally a daughter, Anna, who arrived just before Grace's 30th birthday. 5 children. A house full of noise and laughter and chaos. Grace sometimes looked around her dinner table at Lucas and their children, and could hardly believe this was her life. She still had nightmares sometimes about the hanging, about the mob and the rope, and the terrible certainty that she was going to die. But Lucas was always there to hold her when she woke crying, to remind her that she was safe, that he would never let anyone hurt her. The years passed quickly. Daniel grew tall and strong like his father, eager to learn ranching and take over the work as Lucas got older. The twins were inseparable, finishing each other's sentences and getting into trouble together. Robert was quiet and thoughtful, happiest with a book in his hands, and Anna was bright and curious, asking a million questions about everything. Grace and Lucas's love never faded. If anything, it grew deeper with time, seasoned by shared experience and the life they had built together. They still sat on the porch together on summer evenings, watching the sunset and talking about everything and nothing. "Remember when we met?" Grace asked one evening when the children were grown and starting families of their own. "How could I forget?" Lucas reached over and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. You were standing there so brave, facing down that mob, most beautiful thing I ever saw. I was terrified. You were magnificent." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Best decision I ever made, riding between you and that rope. Best thing that ever happened to me," Grace agreed, "even though it started as the worst day of my life." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their oldest grandson chase chickens around the yard while Daniel's wife called him in for supper. Grace's hair was gray now, and Lucas's face was deeply lined, but his eyes were still the same storm gray that had captured her heart all those years ago. "No regrets?" Lucas asked softly. "Not a single one." Grace squeezed his hand. Only that I almost left you, that I was going to ride away and never know what I would be missing." He turned to look at her. "I love you, Grace Brennan, more today than yesterday and less than tomorrow." "I love you too." She leaned over to kiss him, soft and sweet. "Always have. Always will." As the sun set over the Idaho mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple, Grace reflected on the strange and winding path that had brought her here. From orphan to wife to accused murderess to the woman sitting beside the man she loved, surrounded by children and grandchildren, and a life rich with meaning. It had all started with a rope and a mob and a cowboy who had been brave enough to ride between them and say, "She leaves with me." 4 simple words that had changed everything, that had given her not just her life back but a reason to live it. She had been saved that day, pulled back from the edge of death by a stranger with gray eyes and a good heart. But in saving her, Lucas had also saved himself, had found the home and family he had been drifting away from for so many years. They had saved each other, really. And in doing so, they had built something beautiful and lasting, something that would continue long after they were gone through their children and their children's children. The ranch that had almost been her gallows had become her sanctuary. The town that had wanted her dead had learned to respect her. And the man who had ridden in like something out of a storybook had become her partner, her lover, her best friend, her everything. As darkness fell and the stars began to emerge overhead, Grace and Lucas went inside together, closing the door on another perfect day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new moments to treasure. But tonight, they simply held each other close and gave thanks for the miracle that had brought them together. The rope was long forgotten, crumbled to dust somewhere. But the love that had been born on that terrible day lived on, bright and unbreakable, a testament to the power of courage and the enduring strength of the human heart. And in the small house on the Idaho ranch, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived, Grace and Lucas Brennan fell asleep in each other's arms, grateful beyond measure for every moment they had been given, and looking forward to all the moments yet to come. The story of the mob and the rope and the cowboy who had saved her became family legend, told and retold to children and grandchildren, until it took on an almost mythical quality. But Grace and Lucas never forgot the truth of it, the terror and the joy all mixed together, the moment when everything changed. They lived long lives, Grace passing peacefully in her sleep at age 73, Lucas following her just 6 months later, unable to bear the world without her in it. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, their names carved into simple headstones that their children had placed there. But their love lived on, woven into the fabric of the ranch and the family they had created. Daniel and his children continued working the land, expanding it, making it prosper. The house was added onto again and again, filled with new generations of Brennans who grew up hearing about the grandmother who had been saved by the grandfather who rode between her and a mob. It became a story about courage and love, about standing up for what was right even when it was dangerous, about taking chances and following your heart. It became a reminder that sometimes the worst moments in life can lead to the best things, that tragedy and joy are often intertwined in ways we cannot predict. Years turned to decades, decades to a century. Malad City grew and changed, eventually becoming a small but thriving community. The saloon where the mob had gathered was torn down and replaced with a library. The town square where Grace had nearly hanged was now a park with trees and benches and children playing. But on a hill 3 miles west of town, the Brennan Ranch still stood, passed down through the generations, a testament to what Grace and Lucas had built together. And on that hill their graves remained, side by side, two people who had found each other against all odds and had loved each other through everything. The rope had been ready. The mob had been certain, but one cowboy had been brave enough to ride between them and say, "She leaves with me." And in doing so, he had not just saved a life. He had created one, rich and full and overflowing with love, and that, in the end, was the greatest victory of all.